Hey, right at the top of the show, want to thank and welcome Chris Mills and Adam Russ to the Patreon gang. Pretty great. You can join for free, or you can be like Chris and Adam and throw in a few bucks to support this enterprise, and, depending on your tier, get face-to-face time with me to talk some things out. I know some things. Patreon.com/CNFpod. Oh, and I guess I can say this now. The front runner, The Life of Steve Prefontaine, is available for pre-order. And look at that book cover. My gosh, that is some gorgeous, gorgeous design. I've gotten some nice notes from people who beat that link like it owed them money. You can visit the bookstore of your choice, Powell's, bookshop.org, HarperCollins, Barnes & Noble, yes, even Amazon. Plunk down $32.99 or multiply it times 2 or 3. Everything helps. Every author you know is always begging for pre-orders. It's just part of the game. And you only have so many dollars at your disposal, so I'll just say this. Consider it. Hell, if you order 5 or more, email the receipt to me, and I'll be sure to do a private book club thing for you and your crew. And lastly, promotional support for this podcast brought to you by the 2025 Power of Narrative Conference. Happy New Year, by the way. Celebrating its 26th year on the last weekend of March, being the 28th and the 29th. 300 to 400 journalists from around the world will descend on Boston, Massachusetts. Talk journalism and long form and all the good stuff. Keynote speakers are Susan Orlean, Connie Schultz, and Dan Zach. They'll deliver the knowledge, man. Listeners to this podcast can get 15% off your enrollment fee by using the code CNF15. To learn more, go to combeyond.bu.edu and use that CNF15 code.
You need to be a trustful pig.
But, it was a machete brandished.
I almost always have a very specific reader in mind.
I know. I sometimes wish I would have never done any of these things.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
Oh, hey there, CNFers. It's a creative nonfiction podcast, a show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. I'm Brendan O'Mara, the Riff Master. It's that Atavisitan time of the month, and we have Andrew Dubbins, a journalist based out of L.A., who tells a tale about the After Dark Bandit. The police couldn't figure out how the perpetrator ripped off 2 banks at the same time until they discovered there wasn't just one robber, but a pair of them, identical twin brothers. Tell me you don't want to read that. For Andrew, stories of this nature are resource intensive, so he's always seeking the story engine. What drives the narrative forward? In this case, it's kind of a cops and robbers thing, with a sibling discord at the center. Now, with these Atavisitan interviews, we usually hear from the editor of the story. In this case, it is Jonah Ogles. But Jonah's audio came through so poorly that I couldn't use it. I had to nix it. So, we hear from Jonah and Sayward so much that I might just send them their own microphones. Just to zhuzh things up. Also, if you're a writer, like 99% of you are, invest in a good microphone. You can easily get a good one, like a really good one, for under $100. You might not be hosting a podcast, but odds are you'll appear on a few. Add it to your gear list. Take good care of it, and it'll last forever. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you can sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. You can read blog posts, like each episode's parting shot. It's kind of a new deal, but it kind of makes it a weekly blog post thing, along with that week's show. I dig it. It's my little internet garden, all right? Andrew is the author of Into Enemy Waters, the story of World War II frogmen who became the Navy SEALs. He was Journalist of the Year by the LA Press Club in 2020, and his work has appeared in Men's Health, Slate, the LA Times, Smithsonian, Alta, and the Daily Beast. In this conversation, we talk about that story engine, how he bankrolls certain gigs out of pocket, and how he makes that happen, and how his passion for good stories drives him and his work. Great stuff. You can learn more about Andrew at andrewdubbins.com, Dubbins. He's not really on social media. Good for him. So check out his website, andrewdubbins.com, read his work, and most notably, read his latest for The Atavist. That's at magazine.atavist.com. And consider subscribing. It's a pretty cheap subscription for 12 blockbuster stories a year. I don't get any kickbacks or commissions. I'm wicked good at business. Parting shot about something that watching the movie Sideways recently made me think of. So here's Andrew. Riff. I gotta ask, like, so as you go to Georgetown, you're there, and you had a political bent, but how did you lock into journalism, and specifically this kind of long form journalism that we're very drawn to?
It was just through reading it. I didn't really love covering politics. Like, I just got a taste of it with internships, and couldn't really geek out on what the political maneuverings and. I have more of an entertainment sensibility, and there's this kind of niche of journalism now, which is laying out stories in 3-act structure and kind of with an eye for film and TV. And I just love that. And I read a lot of them, and yeah, that's kind of how I pivoted in.
Yeah, when I was talking to Jonah yesterday about your piece, what struck for the Atavist was, what struck me about it was, I immediately thought of Vince Gilligan in Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and how there's at the heart of a lot of his work is a brother relationship, and it got me thinking, like your piece for the Atavist. I was like, wow, I feel like Gilligan could lock into something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I love that about it too. That it's such a family story, especially their father had been an influence. He was a bank robber, and he started in Australia, in Melbourne, with a failed bank robbery, and got him outcast to New Zealand, was on the run and breaking into post offices and chiseling open the post office safes. And the boys came along and, got to know their father's trade. And for Doug, he said it was a great adventure, and he'd always volunteer to go along. Peter found it more disruptive, that it was taking him out of school, but they really both admired their dad, especially as a carpenter too. He trained them both in carpentry, and I liked that about it, that they were both learning the criminal trade from their father, but also the carpentry. And they were always on the run from the police, so it brought them close together. And Doug kept calling it this gang of four. We were a gang of four, a close family. And then one by one, their father died, which was a huge loss for Doug. And he continues to speak really emotionally about losing his dad. He keeps his ashes under the seat of his Land Rover that we were driving around in, showed me. And then the mom remarried. So he felt like that was a loss in the gang of four. And then finally the climactic betrayal by his brother. And he said, I really never trusted people after that. It's really a family story at the heart of it, and one of the many things I loved about it.
So backing up a little bit, how did you come across this story and lock into it and get the access you needed to the core brothers, Peter and Doug?
Yeah, so I stumbled on a newspaper article. It was called "The After Dark Bandit Steps into the Light of Giving," and it was about Doug Morgan's charity work, mostly since leaving prison. He's mentored young people to keep them out of jail, at-risk youth. He's volunteered for the Salvation Army in the wake of the big bushfires in southern Australia. And about halfway down in the story, it says, and he was one half of the After Dark Bandit, the infamous identical twin bandits of the 1970s. And then I was hooked and just started reading about these twin bandits, and really nothing in the US on them, but had a lot of coverage in Australia. So, and it was kind of fun reading the newspapers because it unfolds like a mystery, because the media didn't know that it was two guys, that it was twins. So saying, how is this guy getting from point A to point B so quickly? He must be driving a fast car. And they're grappling with why in one robbery is he kind of chatty, and then in the next he's really aggressive, and they didn't know. And then the great twist, as I'm reading these old newspapers, oh my God, there wasn't one, there was two. So it really had me hooked. I love the family aspect. It's, stranger than fiction is kind of a genre I like. It's two pretending to be the same person. It's just, you can't even make that up. And it also had this great outdoor adventure aspect to it, robbing these rural banks and escaping into the bush on motorbikes and bicycles. And they used a canoe on one job. Peter did a homemade canoe. So I was hoping in this story to get to capture some of the beauty of Australia. And then as I got to know them, they're such interesting characters. I mean, sometimes they'll have a source who just answers yes, no. That is far from Doug and Peter. They would tell these long tales, and I just had so much rich material. As for reaching them, it was tricky, but they were both really gracious. And once I went over there, and that's kind of what it took, they appreciated, I put my money where my mouth is and flew all that way and got to spend, about a week with them. And
now, because they have such a fractious relationship and are by and large estranged, like, how did you navigate talking to each one of them and playing information you're getting from one with the other just to round out this story?
I interviewed them separately. Yeah, they don't really communicate anymore. The second part of what you mentioned was a little tough in that, and part of it is because this all happened so long ago, that their tellings of these same stories could be a little bit different. So it's, finding what they agreed on. But sometimes I'd get a great anecdote from one and the other one would say, no, that's not how it went. And a couple times in the story, you'll notice I indicate that, Doug's memories of this were different. But, a lot of this stuff was backed up in police reports and court records and newspapers. That was, I'd say, was one of the challenges, is getting two different sides of the story.
And I know as a reporter and interviewing people, and you're trying to get a lot of detail, especially detail that might be sensitive or just going down roads that people sometimes don't want to go down, and you're always kind of drumming the same beat, like trying to get more detail. Like, how did you, if you experience this at all, like when someone might be getting impatient with you as you're trying to get information, like how do you navigate that? And maybe if you experience it with this story, how did you roll with the conversations you were having?
Yeah, that happens a lot, especially these older stories where people are just like, why is this interesting to you? This happened so long ago. I remember Doug saying, like, don't you have any cool gangsters in the U.S. you can write about? Like, why come all this way? But then also, they're 70 years old. They want to talk about their lives. And it's always an advantage. Like, you wouldn't think that, people want the raw story that nobody else has. But I actually prefer when they have done media interviews, because they've thought about this stuff and thought more deeply about it. They're not retelling it for the first time. So I find that usually if a source is willing to talk, they're going to talk, and they're going to give you the story. And again, they appreciated that I came all that way. So they wanted to be helpful. And so I don't think they minded about all my detailed questions.
Well, and circling back to that, the fact that you flew all the way from LA to Australia to meet face to face, maybe you can just speak to, especially in this more detached digital age of reporting, where a lot of people are texting or email, Zoom, and there isn't much by way of face-to-face encounters in journalism these days, it seems. Like, maybe you can speak to just the import of making that effort, going door to door, and in this case, flying over the ocean to see them face-to-face.
Yeah, well, I got so much more on that trip than I would have even just doing Zoom with them, because it shows them that I'm serious and I care about telling their story well, and sensitivity. It's also fun. I mean, it was an adventure, and these guys were, you can do the touristy Australian, but I never would have gotten to these little towns and seen Warburton and Heathcote and met these guys. I mean, Doug, when I first met him, he had a box of his dad's favorite cookies. They call them biscuits, and he had an itinerary for my whole week. This is what I want to show you, and his robbery sites. And Ned Kelly had grown up in the area, and a bar that his dad liked, and places that were important to his dad. And it was neat. He wanted, to make use of my time there, and driving around in his old Land Rover. And he said, I don't trust a Yank to drive on the on the wrong side of the road. And then, it's just getting to know this guy a little and see his paintings. He was an amazing painter, painting these really moody portraits of Ned Kelly and the Australian bush, and talked a lot about painting. My sister and dad both, paint for fun. And I couldn't put a lot of that in the story, but it was he learned in prison. He said one of the heavies spotted my talent. A guy planted a car bomb in Melbourne. And, so he had this little painting community in Pentridge, which is like the Alcatraz of Australia, really high security prison. And he said, have you heard of the Heidelberg School? I said, no. He showed me these pictures of beautiful Australian Impressionism. So none of which was in the story, but are all neat travel and memory experiences for me. And then we talked a lot about his charity work. He had volunteered in the wake of this big bushfire. And I remember him telling me a story that was, I had in an early draft, but he said I was just greeting people as they were coming in who'd lost everything at the Salvation Army. He said, I remember this old woman coming in and asking for a dinner set. He said, so I'm going around helping her pick out the gravy boat and trying to match all the plates. And he said, and I finally lay it all out in front of her, and she just starts weeping. And he said, I never really knew why she was weeping, whether it was my helpfulness or whether she just lost everything and couldn't replace it. But then he connected it back to bank robbing. He said, I'd always just been counting heads coming in and out of the bank, but I really started to see people as people, and to sympathize with their loss. And it's just, you wouldn't get any of that. You got to be driving around and seeing the burnt trees. And it was necessary for this story to go over and spend time with them. And Peter too, meeting him in Mernda. And Peter's thing was really about setting the record straight, because the story has been told, in newspapers, and there's been various tellings, and he was constantly correcting my, preconceptions, one of which was the way they got into robbing. As I had kind of imagined it, they built a pair of house frames. The guy didn't pay him on time, and Peter wanted money for Easter. And he kept correcting me, and he said, no, it wasn't really about the money. It was about the fact that this guy had such control over my livelihood that he could hold up these two checks. And Peter was more about taking back the power, which is subtle. I mean, I would have written it as, yeah, he needed cash for Easter, but he kept correcting me. No, it was more about just having power over my own life and my family. And he also had some health issues we talked about as he was a kid. So he was worried that, he wasn't going to live long, and carpe diem, go out and get the money. So just little nuances that you get in person that you wouldn't otherwise.
Oh yeah, and he also mentioned, or you're right, how adrenaline was a powerful drug too. So there was that component of just addicted to the heist itself. Yeah.
I mean, the adrenaline of planning it, these bush escapes, and then getting away with it, I think was a big thing for Peter, like that victory over the police and just craving that. But yeah, both talked about adrenaline in the bush. It's pretty wild. They said, you come back bloodied and, running in, because they'd be escaping at night with no flashlights, because that's a dead giveaway when the police are setting up roadblocks. They'd see the lights. So he'd say you just bang into these low-hanging eucalyptus trees, and Doug said, I fell asleep once and I woke up and had almost would have drowned had I not woken up because of such heavy rains. And it's really wild country, which was the reason they wouldn't rob in the summer months. They didn't want to get bitten by a poisonous snake. And both of them said the same thing on that. It's not so much a fear of the snake. It's that if you get a bite, you're going to have to turn yourself in. And, then you're doing time for the robberies too. But yeah, they said you wouldn't really feel the pain. It wouldn't hit you. You'd just be exhausted the next day because of that adrenaline rush, which is another thing. I mean, when you watch like these bank robber movies, it's all bravado, but these were young guys and they were terrified because the police had much bigger guns. At a certain stage of their robberies after that Torquay shooting, they were wanted as deadly criminals, and it's one against all of Victoria's police. So there's some fear on their part, which I don't always appreciate. When the bank robber is often as nervous going into the bank as the customers are, which that was something Peter had said about Heathcote that stuck with me. But yes, adrenaline for both of them was driving some of this.
And there's a moment too where you cite there's a book by Jeff Wilkinson and another co-author called Double Trouble, where they wrote about the twins and their and these exploits. And what that got me thinking of was how you retelling this story and how you approach it and make it fresh when there's been accounts of it. So how are you navigating and how are you processing that to make it feel fresh, even though things have been told before?
Yeah, and that was a great book, and I got to talk to Jeff when I was over there, and he was the police reporter who was covering this, so he had wonderful records and access on the police side of the story, had interviewed Doug, but he hadn't gotten Peter to talk for his book. And so that was a half of the story that I thought needed telling. And the other thing was how many books have been written on Churchill, and Eric Larson, wrote a Churchill book. So you come in with your own approach. And my approach was really about the core relationship of the story, which is these two brothers' relationship, and starting with that gang of four and kind of relying on each other, their father dying, and then going into this criminal enterprise together and really not liking each other every step of the way, and yet really not being able to break from one another either. I mean, there's so many moments of falling out, which was a little tricky to write in the book because, the editors and I imagine the readers are, why do these guys keep ending up working together if they're threatening each other? But it's because, they're brothers and they're all they had after, the kind of the loss of their father. So focusing on this core relationship between the brothers was really, I felt totally new and hadn't been done before.
What struck me too about reading the piece was the movie The Prestige. Have you seen that?
I love that movie. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of Christopher Nolan's best movies. Not as popular as a lot of other ones, but should be. And it's just such a tale and rivalry, but also dedication and obsession. And at the heart of it, spoiler alert, there are these twin magicians who are able to pull off illusions because they're able to be in two places at once. Was that was it just something that was on the forefront of your mind as you were unpacking and reporting out this story?
Yeah. So fun bit of trivia about that movie. Jonathan Nolan, Chris Nolan's brother, the screenwriter, went to Georgetown and was developing that in a screenwriting class that I had taken at Georgetown. And I just remember thinking to myself, he's writing The Prestige, when he's, early 20s. And I'm, not writing the person. Like I was pretty ahead of his time. And yeah, I love that movie. I did think about that movie, that twin twist. And I remember in outlining this thinking, is there a way to do that so that you hold the twist till like 3/4, but you couldn't do that and tell the story of their childhood, which is so vital to this. But yeah, that's the twist of this one too. Oh my God, it's not one, it's two.
Yeah. Well, that gets to a great point about structure and experimenting with how you're moving around these blocks. And you've broken this up into, I think it's 10 little chapters. They're not numbered, but they are named. And yeah, those modular parts and how you are, bridging the big time gaps by virtue of this structure. And then you just said, like, maybe there's a way you could hold that twist to the end, but it didn't work out that way. So maybe just talk a little bit about how you were thinking about the pieces and the structure and how to best evoke the core ethos of this story.
Yeah, I mean, so that is the twist of the story. And if you held it, you'd have to kind of write it from a police perspective. But I was getting the brother side of the story, which again, I wanted this story of the sibling rivalry and their relationship. And another thing I thought to myself is that you also need to open with a lead that's going to hook people. And I thought that twist is a great lead. The police learning that this genius bandit we've been chasing is not one man, but two. So, attention span these days, getting people hooked in the first section. And then from there, it's pretty much chronological. Just went back to their childhood. I wanted to get into some of the bushranger lore, which is another thing that hadn't really been done. Is these brothers have been nicknamed by media the last bushrangers. I don't think that ended up in the story, but they very much fit the mold of these bushrangers of old. I just overview the history, but Australia was a Great Britain's penal colony, and the original bushrangers were escaped convicts who got out of the colony into the woods, formed little societies gathering weapons and supplies. And then the real golden age of bushranging was the gold rush in the mid 1800s, where they were hitting gold escorts and robbing banks and then escaping into the bush. Some of these guys became folkloric for usually these robberies with a lot of flair and avoiding violence. I spoke to this professor. He didn't end up in the article, but Dr. Graham Seal was his name. And he came up with this Robin Hood principle, why the bushrangers that achieved folkloric status did. And it was avoiding violence and some flair, and also aligning themselves with the underclass and the impoverished. So you had Ned Kelly during a robbery. He burnt the mortgage papers of the small farmers during one of his heists, started getting some of the local support. And I love this whole bushranger history because it ties in today. You have split opinions on the bushrangers of Australia. Some think they're psychopaths, whereas others see them as folk heroes. There's even Ned Kelly was wearing armor in his last stand, and you'll see mailboxes in Australia, which is his helmet, and slip the mail through the helmet visor. So some people, and it's similar to like our Old West Jesse James or Dillinger, where some people think, God, these were psychopaths, and yet they have this kind of folkloric support. So overlapping that a little bit with the story of these brothers, and it doesn't all connect, because in the end there was violence used, and but the bush escapes definitely were harkened back to the Australian bushrangers of old.
Now, when you're out reporting, and in this instance of going all the way to Australia, meeting with the brothers and going around in the cars and seeing things, what are the tools that you like to have with you for your information gathering? And then how are you processing that, say, at the end of the day?
Well, always a voice recorder and a notebook. And that I'd say was another challenge in that these guys were such good storytellers. I had them just hundreds of pages probably of recordings. And then, in the notebook, it's always scribbling the visual details, what what everything looks like. I snap photos too, and I think like walking around Warburton where Doug robbed the bank, snapping pictures of what it looks like today and for description. But yeah, it's pretty basic, just a recorder and a notebook.
Yeah, and taking photos too, I think, is kind of an underrated reporting tool, because it's just sometimes, even if you scribble things down, you just end up maybe missing a certain detail, or maybe even write it down wrong, which just happens to me an unsettling amount of time, and I don't know why. And then I'll check it up against an image. I'm like, why did I say it was that color when it was that one? It just is like, it's just kind of bonkers, and maybe it's just my own effed up head. But it's just, yeah, it's just like taking those pictures and they're like, okay, there it is, and now you've got that detail, and it's you can really properly evoke it in an accurate way.
When you're in the moment and everything is so raw, you're like, oh, I won't forget this. But you always forget it because it's, I mean, in this case, a year later. So you need some either note that you wrote or picture that you took. The other thing is like taking a picture of a neat little history that's on a road sign, that you might want to use. So, yeah, I agree. Pictures are helpful.
Kind of just going back to the putting your money where your mouth was in terms of shipping yourself to Australia. And some feedback I get from a lot of journalists on this show too is, well, let me poke in here and clarify, not necessarily journalists on this show, but journalists who listen to this show. That's kind of what I meant. And we're going to dive into a little bit of the money aspect of doing this kind of thing. It's just how journalists and freelancers report out stories of this nature, just like the stuff that's out of pocket. And, you really kind of have to advance yourself money in some cases to make this kind of trip happen. So how have you navigated that in your career? And like, what were some of the upfront costs that you needed to shoulder, to get yourself over to Australia?
Yeah, I didn't pitch this until after I had done that trip. So yeah, I was paying for that out of pocket. And I have done that before. I've done it both ways. Sometimes it's on assignment. Sometimes I'm just upfronting it. Yeah. But it worked out. I found a home for it, but it might not have. I was pretty confident that this one would get picked up. I just believe in these stories. The first one I did out of school was about a pilot who was flying his family in this huge winter storm in the early 80s and crashed his plane in northern New Mexico. Wife died in the crash, and he and his teen son survived in the cockpit, this little Beechcraft Bonanza, for 6 days, these huge blizzards buried the plane. Twist was he was a drug smuggler, and there was $250,000 on the plane. And his Cuban buddies rented helicopters, and the Unser brothers, the famous race car drivers, they had a ranch in the area. They were trying to get up to the wreck. So it was this race to get to the wreck and get the money and get him and his son out of there. And I had no outlet for this one. And I just went hog wild and drove 9 hours out to Escalante to meet the pilot's best friend, flew up to Portland to meet his brother, and it's just pure passion and loving the story and wanting to get to the bottom of it. The bit about the money had really never been found, so there was an investigative aspect to it. So yeah, I just do it for the love of the story, and I'm confident that somebody will see something in it.
A long time, like Louisa Thomas has been on the show a handful of times. She's a New Yorker staff writer, instructor in NYU and stuff like that. But the first time she was on, she talked about how she subsidized some of the freelance writing that she does sort of tweet out, and there was any number of writing that, you're like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I don't tweet about, and that helps kind of subsidize the enterprise. And I wonder for you, is that, speaking of like the financial part of being a freelancer, is there, what kind of gigs, if any, do you take to help subsidize the passion project so you can take these flights and hopefully sell them to a place like the Atavist?
I've kept marketing and communication jobs going over the years. I'm adjunct instructor at USC. So yeah, it's definitely, I am in agreement with her that to have a day job going is very helpful. And then you can write for passion and pursue the stories you want, and have the creative energy. If I was writing about a topic that didn't interest me all day, I might not have the fire in my belly to go fly to Australia. And, so it's definitely helpful to have the paycheck coming in at the same time.
Yeah, because I know when she and I had first spoken this several years ago at this point, and because when you would look online, on social media or whatever, and you're just seeing people just seem to just be unilaterally crushing it. They're getting this cover story on Outside, or they're just got a piece in the New Yorker, and you're like, damn, how are they making this happen? And then you start questioning your own path and how crummy you are, and then you realize that there are these other things that aren't getting pushed out to Instagram or whatever, and you're like, oh, okay. When you have a better understanding of that, suddenly you're like, oh, okay, I don't feel so crummy, because there are these revenue streams that no one is publicizing as much as that nice glossy cover story.
Yeah, I mean, it's not news that journalism is in it's tough finding a place that'll pay you to write as a staff writer. I don't
for
think
sure.
There are many magazines, so it's kind of a freelancey world, and you just have to love telling stories and find a way to make it work. And
I feel like the way you are screening the stories you pursue, because they're so resource intensive, like you wouldn't have flown to Australia if you're like, no, this thing has certain story beats to it that are just too good to pass up. So what is that filter process where you're like, okay, now I'm ready to go whole hog?
I really look for things with film and TV potential.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, we're talking about how to make money doing this, and that's another way to, if you can option these and get a little money that way. And it's because they're great stories too, true crime stories, and fun to tell and fun to report. So that's part of the the decision-making process, whether to pull the trigger. Do I think there's going to be some Hollywood interest? There's elements to a story that I love, like a good story engine. Eric Larson talks about this in his afterword I was reading on the sinking of the Lusitania dead wake. He's like, I need a really strong story engine, whether it's a ship voyage and for this, it's got the cops and robbers engine. You want to see if these two bandits are going to get away with it. So there's ingredients that I feel like a story needs. I am pretty careful about what I decide to dive into, and it's got to check a few boxes.
Yeah, I kind of liken it to this long form journalism that back in the day was something you could be a staff writer for and write 4 pieces a year and make a good living, and that was your career. And now I kind of liken it to being a short story writer or something. It's just like you would never in a million years be like, I'm going to have a career and put food on the table being a short story writer, but damn it, I love writing short stories, so I'm just going to try to publish wherever I can. And I feel like this kind of long form journalism and narrative nonfiction, it's almost like you have to think of it as a short story writer and more as the artistic and passionate pursuit. And yeah, maybe you can make a few bucks, but ideally it's just you're putting a few out because there's something you love to do, not because you love to do it and it'll pay you well.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. I mean, you could say the same of screenwriters too. How many are actually making a living at it? Just keep their day job and do it on the side and just hope that one gets picked up.
Yeah. And then there are some people who do this kind of work that we love, and then there'll be, fact checking here and there and all these other little gigs, and it's just like, yeah, it's just, I think it underscores how you just need to have a burning love for this kind of narrative nonfiction, and the juice is in the reporting and the writing of it, and then just controlling those controllables is really the juice for you. It has to be, because otherwise you just be a rotten, bitter husk.
Right. No, I mean, you have to love it. And it's like, I mean, I kind of mentioned this, but I got to go to Kenya too. And it's one thing to just do the safaris, but my story is about this Egyptian American scientist who was training the Maasai, who traditionally hunt lions, to protect the lions, and using tracking equipment. And so it just adds a whole nother layer to your trip when you're hanging out with the Maasai and visiting their camp and seeing Kenya through a local's perspective, as opposed to just kind of the tourist trip. So it makes for really great experiences and memories and fun narrative stories.
And I read an essay earlier today and a story in the New York Times about a stand-up comedian and how she's like wrestling with this idea of she has to split so much of her time between. Let me rewind that a little bit. Like, in an ideal world, she would just be writing jokes and working on craft, and that would be it. And now comedians so often have to wrestle with this idea of putting clips up for social media consumption, and that just digs into the stuff that actually makes you better at what you do, which ultimately will make you a more sustainable artist and creative person in the long run. And I see a lot of writers online too who seem to be more performative, just saying whatever, be it a cheesy picture of them at a desk, and I'm like, who's setting up their? Is anyone taking this picture, or are you like taking the time to like set your phone up in the corner of your office and then taking a candid of yourself, which is just gross to me. But I wonder how you just navigate the social media aspect, the online posturing of it that is just inherent and endemic to this kind of business now.
Yeah, I have a short answer for that one, which is I don't. I have no social media presence. And I remember kind of when I was putting out the book, wishing that I had built more of a big audience. But I had this friend who was in the early days of taking pictures of food on Instagram, which now everyone does, but she was lighting it well and she had a big following. And I remember asking her advice, like, okay, how do I, in a couple weeks, build? And she said, it's just so saturated now with big brands that it's really hard to compete. It's almost like if you haven't already built the audience and built the brand, like, why bother? And I just don't enjoy it. I'm not good at faking it. So I don't really even try on social media.
Yeah. Well, and that's oftentimes a hard conversation you have to have, say, with a book editor or an agent. Like, they want to see a robust social media following, which I think is largely meaningless, but it's a number they can point to. And how did you wrestle with that when, Into Enemy Waters came out? Because that's something a lot of people I talk to on this show, they wrestle with that whole platform aspect of promoting their own books.
Yeah, I know. I remember talking to some writers too, and they're like, it's such a different muscle than writing. And a lot of writers do not like having to flex that publicity muscle. I did a lot of podcast interviews. I did a book signing, book reading. And I did some promotion, got some blurbs for it. And yeah, I just the social media isn't my strong suit, but I tried to get it out as best I could. And I think the COVID changed the model where it used to be going around to bookstores and having like a live publicity tour, but now it's a lot more talking to podcasters and niche blogs. And the excerpt was really cool. I got an excerpt in Smithsonian and
nice. Did
kind of a side-by-side story with Alta, which is a magazine I love here in California. I've written a couple features for them. Yeah, I guess the short answer is I did everything but social media.
Yeah. What I'd like to piggyback on too is just ideas. Long stories like what you've done for the Atavist, they take a lot of time and resources. And how many projects do you tend to have in the hopper going at a given time?
No more than 2. Yeah, they're pretty all intensive. Especially when you keep the day job going and you're writing on the side.
Yeah.
So yeah, no more than 2. I have a this kind of cool sports story in colonial India, this underdog sports story that I'm working on with David Woolman. He's a friend and fellow writer. He's launching Story Studio. He's going to start publishing narrative nonfiction. So I'm hoping to get that out early next year. So I was kind of working on that one side by side with this one. But yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's a heavy lift. It's pretty close to a book's worth of work for these long form articles. I mean, you collect almost as much reporting, and whittling it down is not easy.
Oh, absolutely. And I think in a lot of people's heads who have day jobs and they wish their creative pursuit was like the thing that supported them. And sometimes I bristle at that. I'm like, I wonder if it was the sole purview, would you still have the energy and passion that it takes to do this kind of work? And sometimes that day job, I can't tell you, there's been a number of times where having that day job has put me in touch with people I wouldn't normally be put in touch with, and in some cases it led to work. It led to the publication of my first book. I won't belabor that story, but it happened. I was fitting someone for running shoes, and I wonder just for you, because you've got your irons in a lot of fires, the day job and the adjuncts. Would you trade that in to be able to do this full time, or do you find that part of what nourishes you to do this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have done it full time. Like to finish the book, I was pretty much full time writing, and I find myself sometimes when you wake up with a full day to write, I find myself less productive than when I'm like, okay, right. I got to get my writing done before work starts at 9, or you really make use of the windows that you have.
That's so true.
When you have a whole day, it can kind of just stress you out, and you can procrastinate and clean. And
oh yeah.
So there's that advantage too, is it focuses you. And yeah, I agree with that. Like sometimes, I've worked with some clients in the environmental sector, and the writing and the marketing work can be symbiotic sometimes.
Yeah, it's good to hear that. I think people like hearing that too, because I think and I might be projecting a bit, but I have a feeling some people feel this way. It's just like when you go to school for a thing, be it journalism or whatever, and you want to be a creative person and do that kind of work, and then you have to take on a desk job or something else, and then you have to do your art in the nooks and crannies of your life. Sometimes you can feel less than if you're not making it with the art that you love. And I don't know, it's just good to hear people be like, no, it's okay to have a 30 or 40 hour a week job, and then if you love it so much that you find it elsewhere, and then maybe you can scale back on the day jobby stuff if the other thing picks up some momentum. So I think it's good for people to hear you're not less than if you need a day job. In fact, it's probably a good idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure you've found through all the people you've interviewed that there's really no one model these days, right? It's just a choose your own adventure.
Right. Well, yeah, because we come of age or we come up with what the generation or generations did before us, and you try to follow that playbook. And when that playbook inevitably just doesn't work, you start flailing, or you start getting really frustrated and bitter. Like, why can't I have the career that Mike Sager or even going back way far, like that Gay Talese had? Well, the fact of the matter is, like, that ecosystem is dead, but you're kind of reared on that ecosystem. And then when it doesn't work for you, you're like, it's hard to adapt, and you have to just flail until you kind of figure it out. And sometimes that can take decades. And by then, some people are just like, fuck it, I'm going to law school.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you just really need to love the stories or the just narrative nonfiction in general. And I love the stories and finding a cool untold tale and telling it well.
Oh yeah, that's well put, and it definitely comes across in this Atavist story, which is just such a trip and such a cool story that I'm so glad that people get to experience and then hear some of the backstory of it and how you go about this work, Andrew. So the one thing I love to ask closing these conversations is just asking the guest for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners, and that can just be anything that you're thinking about. It being the end of the year, maybe you have some New Year's resolution kind of advice or just anything else you're excited about.
I have been, it's kind of a relaxing coming off this story, just been watching Sons of Anarchy. So I can give that recommendation as kind of a fun older show if you're into, the biker culture. It's fun watching a show set in around Lodi, which is, I had written a story about this Cadillac dealer who went undercover and busted this New York mob boss, Joseph Bonanno, in a little town called Lodi, and just, you pass through it. So it's fun seeing all these little towns in California. So it's not a very inspiring New Year's resolution or anything, but fun show to check out. People need some watching.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Andrew, this is so great to talk to you about your Atavist piece and to get a sense of how you go about the work. So just thank you so much for carving out the time and for talking shop here on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brendan. It was fun.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you for making it this far, for listening to the show. Thanks to Andrew for the time. Jonah, too, even though his audio didn't make it into the show. And, of course, the Atavist, just in general, for being a pal of the show. Going into our 4th year of doing this, pretty amazing. Awesome partnership. I'm so glad, so grateful for it. Because narrative journalism is like my jam, it's my thing. And so to be able to hang out with the Atavistian people, and the fact that they want to continue to hang out with me is it's pretty cool. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. And thanks to the Power of Narrative Conference for promotional support. Go to combeyond.bu.edu. Check out the conference. See if it lights you up. And if it does, CNF 15 at checkout. You get a sweet deal. Some burrito money or book money. Go get a burrito. Don't forget to consider pre-ordering the Frontrunner. Actually, screw the burrito. Get the Frontrunner. Melanie and I have a stack of old DVDs we're looking to donate or keep. We're looking to just continually shrink our footprint as much as possible. And so we have a stack of DVDs, and we don't even subscribe to a lot of streaming services. We don't subscribe to any. Like, I mean that. We don't even have Netflix. I know. But we also have a lot of physical media, and then much of it we don't need anymore, even though we prefer physical media. Not a euphemism. And so we've got a pile, and we're just going top down. Take the decision out of it. Sideways, starring Paul Giamatti and Thomas Hayden Church, is a buddy movie, wine country buddy movie, based on a novel of the same name. Didn't age well. Most things from the aughts I'm finding have not aged well, except Napoleon Dynamite. Well, Giamatti's character, Miles, is an alcoholic middle school English teacher, a bit of a maladaptive malcontent, who's written a near 1,000-page novel that no one will buy, surprise. At one point, he's asked what the novel's about by someone, and he can't even explain it. He said, like, it just changes genres, the ending doesn't really make sense, it's a disaster. Finally, when he hears from his agent, she says, and I'm paraphrasing, publishers just didn't know how to market it. 3 years of writing the book, poof. Okay, so here's the lesson. Here's a couple lessons. Well, 1, don't pop a bunch of Xanax and then chug a bunch of wine. And 2, as much as it might make your artist heart squirm, you have to consider how your idea will sell. What does it look like as a product slotted alongside other titles? You have to imagine making the sales pitch to investors who aren't so concerned necessarily about the art, but rather making money of getting a return on that investment, right? You have to code switch in that regard. You kind of have to put on a Don Draper hat like you're going to make that big pitch in front of a client and really make the case for it. It's not unlike what Stephen Hayden said on the pod recently. You have your expertise, and then you select a subject that has a certain measure of baked-in audience. It's no surprise that Stephen wrote about Bruce Springsteen and Pearl Jam, among several other books he's written, and not, let's say, Pavement or Mudhoney. There are scores of brilliant athletes out there, but if you're going to write a golf biography, you're better off finding an angle on Tiger Woods, versus, say, a Fred Couples or Jordan Spieth. It's Tiger moves the meter, no one else does. We might be grossed out by that, but if you have skills as a storyteller or a researcher, a reporter, or writer, you're going to have to sell out a bit, or at least consider it. Now, if you have a steady gig as a professor and you love writing weird essays on esoteric topics, experimental stuff, and you can land a deal with a smaller press, even a bigger one, great, awesome, cool. Then you might not have to be thinking in terms of commercial success or commercial optics. Just because a book is about a famous person doesn't mean it'll be a bestseller, obviously, but it gives you a better shot. It's why my baseball memoir is in the drawer. Memoirs are a tough sell, and frankly, I'd rather keep building my authority with this podcast, and maybe if a biography or 2 or 3 works out, the memoir will then be more enticing. What we find is that people fail to think in terms of how it will look as a product, as a commodity, as something that costs a lot of money to make and something that will hopefully make some dough, is that you just get burned out, bitter, resentful, speaking from experience. So there's no guarantee that it'll work out. And how many people try to write vampire stories after Twilight or horse racing after Seabiscuit? So I'm not saying chase a trend, but there are certain signifiers that make people's heads tilt a little bit. Like, just they make it lean in. And like, okay, now that might have something more of a hook to it. And then you take your skills and lean in that direction. The lesson, be able to sum up the premise of your book in less than 20 seconds. And be thinking about how it'll be marketed. It might just grease the skids a bit for you. Anyway, stay wild, CNFers. If you can do, interview. See ya. Well, and Happy New Year.